And first of all, Boris Johnson disagreed with a very famous Muppet in his address to the UN.
Kermit the Frog sang, "It's not easy being green." You remember that one? I want you to know that he was wrong.
So how easy is it to be green? Let's ask that to Joycelyn Longdon, first of all. So Boris Johnson clearly trying to encourage other countries to go green, but is he right to say that it's the easy option?
I think my question would be, if it was so easy to be green, why Boris Johnson, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, has contributed £4 billion to the oil and gas industry? That's not very green. Why is he not cancelling the Campbell oil field up near Scotland? So if it is so easy to be green, why hasn't Boris Johnson himself made kind of the most pressing green decisions for this country?
Bruce, what do you make of that? Do you think that's fair? I mean, Boris Johnson would no doubt argue that the UK has a good record on cutting back on its dependence on coal. He'd say that they've got world-leading climate targets. They're going to announce their strategy on meeting them in the coming weeks. Do you think it's fair to criticise the UK's record on this? And should Boris Johnson actually get some credit for what's been achieved this week?
I think it's a story of two tales. One is, yes, there's progress, but there's a lot more needs to be done, right? If it was as easy as Joycelyn said, we wouldn't have this conversation. And so the opportunity we have is, how does Boris Johnson, how do governments around the world help people accelerate this transition from fossil fuels? Because it's not as easy as it should be to help transition to electric cars, to electric heat pumps. There's enormous things we can do, but we need the government to be helping make it easier than it is today.
OK, and so let's take a look, Joycelyn, shall we, at what that means for the consumer and how easy that could be. And we'll have a look at what Boris Johnson actually said. He said, "We have nothing to fear and everything to gain from the green industrial revolution." So, Joycelyn, what do you think at the moment of how easy it is for a consumer to go green, and what will they gain?
I think there are some obvious changes that everyone can make that we've heard time and time again: eating less meat, taking more journeys by foot or by bike, flying less. And obviously those are quite easy actions to take. But the more infrastructural decisions that we have to make to be more green are in the hands of the government and are currently not as easy as they could be. We don't have an amazing and affordable transport network for people to, maybe not drive to work or depending on where they're living. And so I think there's a lot more to do infrastructurally from the government to make these decisions easier. So again, as Bruce said, it's a tale of two stories. There are some actions that we can take that are really simple, really easy, and everyone should be doing them. But there's a lot more to be done systematically.
Well, yes, and Bruce, do you agree with that? Is this down to governments to try and make some of these decisions more attractive and cheaper as well? Joycelyn was talking about transport, but there's also the cost of insulating and heating your homes as well, isn't there? Is it down to the government to make that cheaper and easier for us?
That's right. I mean, obviously, there's a lot we can do as individuals. We can do a lot of things in our daily life, but we're not going to solve this problem unless we get governments and businesses stepping up to make this easier for everybody. So as you're thinking about things like when your water heater breaks, is there a program in place to help people afford to make the transition to a clean, non-fossil fuel alternative? Those kind of programs rest with the government, helping make sure those programs are in place. And that's what we need across the world today so that we can get this problem solved in the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, and Joycelyn, Bruce mentioned corporations and companies there. What role does the private sector have?
The role of the private sector is to make sure that they are working in line with the targets that we have as a community. This takes all of us, and companies at the moment aren't taking so much responsibility and are more interested in greenwashing consumers instead of actually being truthful, being honest, and making the hard changes and the hard decisions that they will have to make in order for us to reach the goals that we need to.
Is it the truth, Bruce, that ultimately it's going to make good financial sense to go green? We heard Boris Johnson talking about it being the lucrative option. Is that true to say that that's ultimately going to help encourage businesses to take that course?
I think that's one of the most exciting developments in the last 5 to 10 years, which is the price of clean energy today is cheaper than fossil fuels. Thinking about the gas crisis in the UK and around Europe right now, the continued reliance on fossil fuels is terrible for our climate, but it's also terrible for our economy. So you see factories having to shut down because they can't afford to buy natural gas. That wouldn't happen if we had a clean, renewable economy. And so there's enormous upside today. The problem is we have private companies who are lobbying on behalf of oil and gas who are trying to slow down this transition. And currently the governments are listening to them more than the rest of us.
But Bruce, there are jobs in those industries as well, aren't there? And people are worried about losing those jobs.
Enormous. I grew up in the Northwest England, and I go back to visit my mom, and it is amazing to see the wind turbines, right? Those are real jobs, making steel, putting them in the ground, and operating them. So yes, there are enormous upsides economically, but also for the job transition so that people have good family supporting wages.